The crystal chandeliers of the Vienna State Opera House splashed shimmering light across a sea of designer gowns and impeccably tailored tuxedos. It was 2025, and the annual philanthropic gala was the place to be for Europe's elite. Old money mingled with new fortunes, and everyone was desperate to be noticed. Among them, Clarissa Beaumont, Thomas Dequar's mistress, stood swathed in silk and diamonds that weren't exactly hers, basking in the whispers and envious stares. She thought she had won. She had the man, the status, the life that once belonged to Grace Morrow. Then, the orchestra stopped playing. The enormous doors swung open, and every head in the room swiveled. The woman who walked through those doors was not the broken, humiliated wife who had fled Vienna 2 years before. This was someone completely different. Someone who had risen from the ashes, a woman forged in pure fire. Her presence made the chandeliers seem dim, and every other woman in the room faded into the background. Clarissa's champagne glass trembled. The color drained from Thomas's face because Grace Morrow, no, Grace Lauren now, had arrived, and she hadn't come to beg. She had come to take back her throne. Vienna had always been Grace's city. Not by birth. She was born in Marseilles to a family of modest means, but by choice, by love, by the dreams she had woven into its cobblestone streets and Baroque architecture. She'd arrived at 23, a brilliant economics graduate with a scholarship to the University of Vienna. Her eyes wide with wonder at the Ringstrasse imperial elegance, the coffee house culture that smelled of mélange and endless possibilities. That's where she met Thomas Delacroix. He was 30 then, already making a name for himself in his family's international law firm, Delacroix and Associates, with offices in Vienna, Paris, and Geneva. He was everything her young heart could imagine. Sophisticated, well-spoken, with the easy confidence that comes from generations of wealth and privilege. He wooed her at Café Central, took her to performances at the Musikverein, and whispered sweet promises beneath the Gothic spires of St. Stephen's Cathedral. "You're different from everyone I know," he told her once, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw as they stood on the Belvedere Palace terrace, the city glittering below. "You see the world with such clarity, such ambition. You're not content to just exist. You want to build something." She had believed him. God, how she had believed him. They married within a year, a lavish ceremony at the Palais Coburg that blended Marseilles' warmth with Vienna's grandeur. Grace became Mrs. Delacroix, and for 7 years, she threw herself into that role with the same fierce dedication she brought to everything. She became fluent in German, mastered the intricate social customs of Viennese high society, and used her economic expertise to modernize Thomas's firm's investment strategies, increasing their portfolio returns by 40% in 3 years. She hosted charity galas that everyone talked about for months. She sat on the boards of arts foundations and refugee assistance programs. She transformed their penthouse apartment overlooking the Danube into a showpiece that Architectural Digest featured. All clean lines and strategic lighting, modern pieces juxtaposed with carefully selected antiques. And through it all, Thomas smiled at her across dinner tables, held her hand at the opera, and told investors that his wife was his secret weapon. She should have seen it coming. The late nights that stretched longer and longer, the business trips to Geneva that became increasingly frequent, the way his touch became perfunctory, mechanical, as if he were completing a chore rather than loving his wife. But Grace was too busy. She was managing the firm's expansion into Eastern European markets, spearheading a partnership with a Budapest-based financial consultancy, preparing for the firm's 20th anniversary gala. She told herself that marriages went through phases, that successful people sometimes drifted before finding their way back to each other. She told herself lies because the truth was too devastating to face. The truth walked into her life on a Thursday afternoon in March, wearing Giuseppe Zanotti heels and carrying a Birkin bag. Grace had come home early from a board meeting, the spring rain turning Vienna's streets into impressionist paintings of gray and gold. She let herself into their building on Herrengasse, the elegant 19th century facade as familiar as her own heartbeat. The elevator glided smoothly to the top floor. She heard them before she saw them. Laughter, bright and unguarded, coming from the living room. A woman's voice, pitched high with delight, and Thomas responding with a warmth she hadn't heard in months. Grace stood in her own entryway, rainwater dripping from her Burberry trench coat, and watched her husband feed strawberries to a woman who wasn't his wife. She was younger, maybe late 20s, blonde hair cascading in carefully styled waves, the kind of studied beauty that required trainers, stylists, and a complete lack of substance. She was sprawled across Grace's custom Minotti sofa, shoes kicked off, completely at home in a space that wasn't hers. "Thomas," Grace said quietly. They jumped apart like teenagers caught by their parents. But there was no shame in Thomas's face, only annoyance at the interruption. The woman, Clarissa, Grace would later learn, had the nerve to look amused. "Grace." Thomas stood up, adjusting his shirt cuffs in that way he did when he was getting ready to negotiate. "You're home early." Apparently, Grace's voice was ice over an earthquake. "Who is this?" "This is Clarissa Beaumont. We're colleagues." "Colleagues who feed each other fruit on my furniture?" Clarissa rose then, smooth as a cat, and Grace saw with brutal clarity that this woman was wearing one of the negligee sets from the La Perla collection. A gift Grace had bought for herself last Christmas. A gift she'd never seen Thomas even notice. "Oh, sweetie," Clarissa purred, and the condescension in that word could have peeled skin. "He hasn't told you?" "Told me what?" Thomas had the decency to look uncomfortable for all of 3 seconds. Then his face hardened into something Grace had never seen before, cruelty. "I'm in love with Clarissa," he said flatly. "I have been for 18 months. I wanted to tell you after the anniversary gala, but since you're here now." He shrugged. "We're finished, Grace. You and we've been finished for a long time. The apartment spun. Or maybe Grace did." She gripped the console table, a piece she'd found at a Vienna antique market. Restored, cherished. 18 months. Her voice came out strangled. "You've been, while I've been." She couldn't finish. The betrayal was too vast, too complete. "Let's be honest," Thomas said, his tone now clinical, surgical. "You've been more business partner than wife for years. Always networking, always strategizing. When was the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about portfolios or client acquisition?" "I was building our life." The words exploded from Grace. "Everything I did was for us." "No." He shook his head. "Everything you did was for you, for your ego, to prove that the girl from Marseilles could play in Vienna circles. You used me as a stepping stone, Grace. Don't pretend this was love. It was a masterclass in gaslighting." And somewhere in her fracturing mind, Grace recognized it. But recognition didn't stop the pain. It didn't stop the room from tilting. Didn't stop the 7 years of her life from rewinding and revealing themselves as lies. "I want you out by the end of the month," Thomas continued as if discussing a business transaction. "My lawyers will contact yours regarding the divorce. You'll be fairly compensated, of course. I'm not a monster." Clarissa's laugh was soft, victorious. She had settled back onto the sofa, completely comfortable in what was about to become her domain. Grace looked at this woman, this shallow, smirking creature who had waltzed into a marriage and detonated it. And then at Thomas, the man she had loved with every cell of her being. "You deserve each other," Grace whispered. She walked out of that apartment, out of her marriage, her life, her identity, with only her handbag and the clothes she was wearing. She would return later with a lawyer and a moving company to collect her personal belongings. But in that moment, she couldn't breathe in that space for another second. The rain had stopped, leaving Vienna washed clean and indifferent beneath a pale sky. Grace walked through the Innere past the Hofburg Palace where tourists posed for photos, across the Ringstrasse where trams clanged and life continued its relentless forward march. She walked until her feet ached and her lungs burned and the tears finally came. Great gasping sobs that she muffled against the stone wall of an anonymous alley. She had given everything. Her youth, her ambition, herself. She had transformed herself into the perfect wife, the perfect partner, the perfect ornament for Thomas Delacroix's perfect life. And she had been discarded like a piece of outdated furniture. That night, Grace checked into a modest hotel near the Naschmarkt, a far cry from the penthouse, but private, anonymous. She sat on the narrow bed and looked at her reflection in the mirror across the room. She barely recognized herself, not because of the tears or the smudged mascara, but because she saw, perhaps for the first time, what she had become. A woman who had hollowed herself out to fit into someone else's vision, who had measured her worth by her husband's approval, her success by his standards. A woman who had forgotten who Grace Morrow actually was. Her phone buzzed non-stop. Thomas's lawyers were already circling. Friends who had heard rumors were demanding details. Her mother in Marseilles, who somehow already knew, was calling with that particular mix of comfort and, "I told you so," that only mothers can deliver. Grace turned off her phone. In the silence of that hotel room, she made a decision. Not a plan, not yet, but a fundamental, bedrock decision that would shape everything that came after. She would never again reduce herself for anyone. She would never again measure her worth against someone else's ruler. And she would never, ever let Thomas Delacroix or Clarissa Beaumont or anyone else make her feel small. But first, she had to survive the immediate aftermath. The divorce proceedings were brutal. Thomas's family lawyers, the best money could buy, painted Grace as a gold digger who had married for status and was now seeking an undeserved payout. Never mind that she had contributed intellectually and professionally to the firm's success. Never mind that she had sacrificed her own career advancement to play the role of corporate wife. In Vienna's elite circles, where reputation was currency, Grace found herself suddenly uninvited. Charity boards quietly asked her to resign. Friends stopped returning calls. The same society that had embraced her as Mrs. Delacroix closed ranks against Grace Morrow. She had become an embarrassment, a cautionary tale, a divorcee, that particular species of woman that wealthy circles viewed with suspicion and contempt. Only a handful stood by her. Margot Schneider, a fellow board member and one of Vienna's rare genuine souls, who brought coffee and tissues and rage on Grace's behalf. Elise Dubois, her former professor who had mentored her through university and now offered fierce loyalty and practical advice. Leave Vienna, Elise told her over Zahertorta at a quiet cafe in the 7th district. You've given this city enough. Go somewhere you can rebuild without ghosts. Grace considered staying out of pride, out of stubbornness, out of a desire to prove she belonged. But Vienna was no longer hers. Every street held memories that now felt like lies. Every familiar landmark had been poisoned by betrayal. 6 weeks after that devastating Thursday, Grace accepted the divorce settlement, less than she deserved, more than Thomas wanted to give, and booked a one-way ticket to Paris. She wasn't running away, she told herself. She was running towards something, though what that something was, she had no idea. Paris in early summer should have been a postcard. The Seine, golden in the late afternoon light, the chestnut trees in full bloom, cafe terraces crowded with beautiful people performing their beautiful lives. But for Grace, arriving with 2 suitcases and a bank account that would last 6 months if she was careful, the city felt vast and indifferent. She rented a tiny 6th-floor walk-up in the Marais, the kind of apartment that Parisians call charming and everyone else calls claustrophobic. 1 room with a slanted ceiling, a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in, a galley kitchen with a 2-burner stove. The windows overlooked a courtyard where pigeons fought over breadcrumbs, and neighbors hung laundry with the casual grace of people who had never known luxury. It was nothing like the penthouse, nothing like the life she'd built. And that was exactly the point. Grace unpacked her belongings. Designer clothes that now felt like costumes, jewelry that Thomas had given her during better years, framed photos that she immediately turned face down because she couldn't bear to see her own happiness so real in those captured moments, so false in retrospect. She had a plan, or the skeleton of one. She would rebuild her career. She had a degree from a prestigious university, years of experience optimizing investment strategies. Surely someone in Paris would see her value. The rejection emails started almost immediately. Thank you for your interest, but while your qualifications are impressive, or we are looking for, or we've decided to move forward with other candidates. At first, Grace told herself it was bad timing, a competitive market, the challenges of breaking into Paris's insular business culture. But after the 15th rejection, then the 20th, a darker suspicion began to take root. She confirmed it over coffee with a former colleague from her Vienna days, Laurent Chan, who now worked for a private equity firm in Paris's 8th arrondissement. "They're blacklisting you," Laurent said quietly, stirring his espresso with unnecessary focus. "Thomas's family has reached Grace. Old money always does. They've made sure you're persona non grata in certain circles." "That's illegal," Grace said numbly. "It's also unproven. No one puts blacklists in writing anymore. They just, a word here, a subtle suggestion there." She was difficult to work with. The divorce was messy. Her reputation is complicated. Laurent's expression was sympathetic but helpless. "I'm sorry. If I could help." "But you can't," Grace finished for him. "Because helping me would hurt you." He didn't deny it. Grace walked back to her apartment through the golden evening, past couples strolling hand in hand, past tourists taking selfies with the Eiffel Tower in the background, past street musicians playing music that once would have moved her and now just sounded like noise. She had been naive. She had thought that escaping Vienna would be enough, that she could simply start over in a new city with a new chapter. She hadn't understood that in the world she'd inhabited, the world of international law firms and private wealth management, reputations were portable. Whisper campaigns traveled faster than innocence. Thomas had taken everything, not just the marriage, not just the apartment and the social standing. He had taken her professional identity, her ability to work in the field she had devoted herself to. He had taken her future. The money ran low faster than she'd anticipated. Paris was expensive, and even her modest lifestyle was burning through her savings. She started taking whatever work she could find. Administrative positions that required no French business connections, contract work that paid by the hour and offered no security. She filed expense reports for a tech startup in the 11th arrondissement, the founders barely out of university who paid her half what she was worth and felt generous doing it. She translated documents for an export company. Her fluent French and German were finally useful for something besides impressing dinner party guests. She cleaned houses. That was the lowest point. Scrubbing someone else's toilets in a Saint-Germain-des-Prés apartment that reminded her viscerally of the life she'd lost. The woman who hired her was younger than Grace, entitled in that casual way of people born into money, complaining about her husband's long hours at the bank, while Grace nodded and smiled and bleached the grout. Grace cried in the service elevator going down, great shaking sobs that she muffled with her hand because even now, even at rock bottom, she couldn't let anyone see her break. The worst part wasn't the financial humiliation or the physical exhaustion. It was the invisibility. In Vienna, Grace had been somebody. People sought her opinion, valued her insights, respected her presence. Now she was background noise, the woman who cleaned, who filed, who translated, who existed in the margins of other people's important lives. She stopped going out socially. The few invitations she received, pity invites from acquaintances who wanted to help, or worse, who wanted the gossip, she declined with increasingly transparent excuses. She couldn't bear the questions, the careful sympathy, the barely disguised curiosity about her fall from Grace. The isolation was crushing. Grace would go days speaking to no one but shopkeepers and the occasional neighbor on the stairs. Her apartment, so charming in the listing, became a prison. The slanted ceiling that had seemed quaint now felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in. She lost weight not intentionally. She simply forgot to eat, distracted by job applications that went nowhere and bills that kept arriving. Her clothes hung loose. Her face in the mirror looked gaunt, haunted. Her mother called weekly from Marseilles, increasingly worried. "Come home, Sherry," she begged. "Just for a little while. Let us take care of you." But Grace couldn't. Returning to Marseilles felt like admitting defeat, like confirming that she had reached too high and deserved to fall. Her family loved her, but they had never understood her ambitions, her drive to be more than what her origins suggested she should be. Going back felt like death, so she stayed in Paris, treading water, drowning slowly. Then came the party. Grace hadn't wanted to attend. It was Margot, her friend from Vienna, visiting Paris for work, who insisted. "You're isolating yourself," Margot said firmly. "One evening, a few hours, normal human interaction. It's not negotiable." The party was in the 16th arrondissement, a classic Haussmann apartment filled with finance people and their perfectly curated partners. Grace wore one of her Vienna dresses, altered to fit her smaller frame, and makeup carefully applied to hide the shadows under her eyes. She was nursing a glass of wine in the corner, counting the minutes until she could politely leave when she heard it. Thomas's name. 2 women, both dripping with jewelry and entitlement, were standing near the drinks table. "Did you hear about Thomas Delacroix's engagement to that Clarissa girl? They've finally made it official." "Yes, the ring is obscene. They're planning a wedding at the Palais Garnier. Can you imagine? All of Vienna will be there." "What about the first wife? What was her name?" "Grace something. French originally, I think. Completely fell apart after the divorce. I heard she's cleaning houses now." A laugh, cruel and casual. "Some women just can't handle the lifestyle." Grace set down her wine glass with trembling hands. She walked out of that apartment, down the elegant staircase with its wrought iron railings, out onto the street where Paris hummed with indifferent life. She walked to the Seine, stood on the Pont des Arts, where lovers had once attached padlocks, a tradition now banned, the bridge stripped of its romantic debris. The water below was dark, moving slowly toward the sea. Grace thought about jumping, just for a moment. One fleeting, terrifying moment. She thought about how easy it would be to climb over the railing, to let the water take her, to stop fighting against the current that seemed determined to drag her under. But she didn't jump. Instead, something else happened. Something primal and fierce rose up from a place she'd forgotten existed. From the girl who had arrived in Vienna with nothing but ambition and audacity. From the woman who had once believed she could be anything. Rage, pure, clarifying, magnificent rage. Thomas got to move on. He got to marry his mistress in a palace, to be celebrated and congratulated, to rewrite history so that he was the victim of a cold, ambitious wife rather than a cheating coward. And Grace was supposed to quietly disappear, to clean houses and translate documents, and accept that this was her punishment for daring to want more, for believing she deserved better. No. The word formed in her mind with perfect clarity. No. Grace walked back to her apartment with purpose. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat at her tiny table and wrote. Not a plan yet, just thoughts, reflections, observations about everything she'd learned in Vienna. About international finance and investment strategies and market inefficiencies she'd identified but never fully explored. She had knowledge. She had intelligence. She had 7 years of experience operating at the highest levels of European business. What she didn't have was anyone willing to give her a chance, so she would create her own chance. By sunrise, Grace had the outline of a business plan. By the end of the week, she had refined it into something real. A consulting firm, boutique, specialized, targeting the gap between Eastern European markets and Western investment. She knew this space intimately. She spoke the languages. She understood the cultural nuances that Western firms consistently missed. She just needed capital. And since no bank would loan money to a divorced woman with no collateral, she needed to find another way. Grace sold everything she had of value. The jewelry from Thomas on the gray market, no questions asked, at a fraction of its worth, but still enough to matter. The designer clothes, handbags, and accessories that she'd once treasured. She kept only the essentials, the pieces she needed to look credible in business meetings. She moved to an even smaller apartment, this one in the 19th arrondissement, 45 minutes from central Paris by metro, but a quarter of the rent. She lived on rice and lentils and black coffee, and she built. It was exhausting, demoralizing, lonely work. She designed her website on a second-hand laptop, taught herself digital marketing through free online courses, and reached out to every contact who hadn't explicitly ghosted her after the divorce. Most ignored her. Some politely declined. A few were actively hostile. "You have some nerve," one former colleague wrote back, "reaching out after what you put Thomas through." But a handful responded. Small businesses, mostly Eastern European startups looking to expand west. Western companies testing entry into Polish or Czech markets. Clients who were too small or too desperate to care about her tarnished reputation. Grace took every job, no matter how modest the pay. She worked 16-hour days, her tiny apartment littered with papers and coffee cups, the detritus of someone rebuilding from rubble. Slowly, painfully, she began to see progress. Clients came back. Referrals trickled in. Her bank account, once hemorrhaging, stabilized, then grew. 6 months after the party, after that moment on the bridge, Grace landed her first significant client. A Budapest-based fintech company preparing for a Series B funding round with French and German investors. The consulting fee was substantial. More importantly, it was validation. She was good at this, better than good, exceptional. And she was doing it entirely on her own terms. But success felt hollow because every night Grace returned to her shoebox apartment and ate dinner alone and scrolled through social media to see photos of. Thomas and Clarissa were everywhere, at galas, benefits, the very events Grace used to orchestrate. They were living her life, or at least the life she had envisioned for herself. And the most infuriating part? They seemed happy, ridiculously, almost offensively so. Grace realized she needed more than just financial stability. She craved something deeper, something she couldn't quite articulate. She needed to transform into someone they couldn't simply ignore. Someone beyond their dismissals, pity, or casual gossip at parties. Someone truly extraordinary. The catalyst for this transformation emerged from an unlikely source. Elise Dubois, Grace's former professor and mentor from her days in Vienna. Elise, resourceful as ever, tracked Grace down through LinkedIn, discovered her modest consulting website, and sent an email with her signature bluntness. "Stop hiding in the shadows and attend my symposium in London. There are people you need to meet." The symposium centered on emerging markets and global investment strategies, precisely Grace's area of expertise. She possessed one professional outfit that still looked presentable, enough money for a budget flight and a hostel, and, as she saw it, nothing left to lose. London in November was a study in contrasts. Cold and gray, with the Thames River swirling beneath bridges steeped in history. The symposium itself took place at the London School of Economics, a familiar and intellectually stimulating environment for Grace. She diligently attended every panel, meticulously taking notes, and posed insightful questions that showcased her profound understanding of Eastern European market dynamics. During the reception, Elise introduced her to Mikhail Volov, a Russian venture capitalist who had amassed a fortune investing in post-Soviet tech startups. "Your questions about Bulgarian fintech regulations," Mikhail observed in accented English, his pale eyes sharp with intelligence, "were very specific, very informed. Most Western consultants know next to nothing about these markets." "I've worked extensively in the region," Grace responded, carefully avoiding any hint of desperation or overeagerness. "Perhaps we should talk further," Mikhail suggested, handing her a business card embossed with a prestigious London address. "I'm always seeking advisors who genuinely understand where I'm investing." That initial conversation blossomed into a consulting contract, and then another. Mikhail's vast network unlocked doors that had previously seemed impenetrable. She connected with other investors, other entrepreneurs who prioritized expertise over superficial reputation and tangible results over mere social standing. Within 6 months, Grace was earning more than she ever had in Vienna. Within a year, she had firmly established herself as one of Europe's foremost consultants on Eastern European market entry strategies. But the transformation wasn't solely professional. Grace sought therapy, engaging the services of Dr. Amara Okonkwo, a Nigerian-British psychologist specializing in trauma and identity reconstruction. Twice a week, Grace would sit in Dr. Okonkwo's Bloomsbury office and slowly, painfully, sift through the wreckage of her marriage and the woman she had once been. "You constructed your entire identity around being Mrs. Delacqua," Dr. Okonkwo pointed out during one session. "What happens when we dismantle that? Who is Grace?" It was the question Grace had been dodging for 2 long years. The answer didn't come easily, emerging instead in fragments, in uncomfortable self-revelations, in the gradual process of separating her authentic desires from the performative life she had been leading. Grace came to realize that she had never genuinely craved the charity galas, the relentless networking dinners, or the exhausting pursuit of maintaining social status. What she had truly desired was Thomas's approval, wanting to feel valuable to him, mistakenly equating his satisfaction with her own happiness. "What do you actually love?" Dr. Okonkwo probed. Grace reflected, recalling the moments in Vienna when she had felt most alive, not at those superficial parties, but in her office late at night, meticulously analyzing market data, identifying hidden patterns, and solving intricate financial puzzles. The intellectual challenge, the profound satisfaction of being right, of witnessing her strategies bear fruit. "I love the work," Grace said, the realization dawning on her. Not the performance surrounding it, just the work itself. "Then build a life around that," Dr. Okonkwo advised simply. Grace began investing in herself with the same unwavering dedication she had once poured into her marriage. She hired a personal trainer, not to achieve some unattainable aesthetic ideal, but to cultivate genuine strength. She took up kickboxing, reveling in the physical release, the permission to strike something, to channel her pent-up rage into a productive outlet. She voraciously consumed everything she could about private equity, venture capital, and emerging markets. She achieved fluency in Polish and significantly improved her Russian. She attended conferences, published articles in reputable economic journals under her maiden name, Grace Morrow, severing the last official connection to Thomas Delacroix. She approached her transformation methodically, strategically. Every choice was deliberate, meticulously building towards a specific vision of the woman she aspired to become. And slowly, remarkably, she began to genuinely enjoy her own company. The profound loneliness that had nearly consumed her in Paris metamorphosed into a chosen, treasured solitude. She relocated to a nicer apartment in the 10th arrondissement. Nothing extravagant, but bright, airy, and entirely hers. She filled it with books and art that she genuinely loved, not pieces selected solely to impress visitors. She traveled for work, visiting Prague, Budapest, Warsaw, and Sofia, but also for herself. Solo trips where she meandered through cities at her own pace, savored meals at restaurants without photographing them, and experienced places without performing the experience for anyone else's benefit. Grace was 34 years old and learning, for the first time, how to be alone without feeling lonely. Then came the opportunity that would irrevocably alter her trajectory. Mikhail Volov summoned her to London for a private meeting. His office, overlooking Canary Wharf, was a monument to glass, steel, and the unapologetic modernity of new money. "I'm establishing a new fund," Mikhail announced without preamble, focused exclusively on Eastern European and Central Asian tech startups. "I want you as a partner." Grace's heart skipped a beat. Partner meant an equity stake. "You'll lead the European operations, make the crucial investment decisions, build the portfolio. I'll provide the capital and my extensive network. You provide the expertise and the sound judgment." He slid a contract across the polished desk. "This is what I'm offering." Grace meticulously reviewed the documents, her mind racing with the implications and the possibilities. It was more than she had dared to dream. Not just employment, but ownership. A genuine stake in something substantial. "Why me?" she asked, genuinely curious. Mikhail offered a thin smile. "Because you're hungry. Because you've been underestimated and have everything to prove. And because you're exceptionally brilliant at what you do and no longer waste time pretending otherwise." He leaned back in his chair. "Also, because I investigate everyone I work with, and I know what your ex-husband did to you. I deeply respect someone who rebuilds from that kind of devastation." Grace signed the contract. The fund, Volov and Morrow Capital, launched 6 months later. Their initial investment, a Polish cybersecurity startup, was acquired by a major tech company just 18 months later, generating a return of 12 times their initial capital. Their second investment, a Romanian AI company, secured a massive contract with the European Union and tripled in valuation. Grace possessed an exceptional ability to identify potential. Years of being underestimated had honed her skills to recognize value that others overlooked, to spot diamonds in the rough markets that Western investors dismissed as too risky or too foreign. The financial press began to take notice. Forbes ran a feature profile, Grace Morrow, the quiet genius of Eastern European tech investment. The Financial Times included her in their 40 under 40 list of influential figures in European finance. The money arrived not gradually, but rapidly, abundantly, almost overwhelmingly. Grace transitioned from comfortable to wealthy in less than 2 years. But she didn't spend her newfound wealth in the ostentatious manner she had once witnessed. She invested the majority of it, building real assets, creating genuine security rather than merely performing success. She purchased an apartment in London, not a lavish penthouse, but a beautiful 2-bedroom flat in Notting Hill, boasting high ceilings and a charming small garden. She furnished it with care and attention to detail, but without ostentation, creating a space that felt like a sanctuary. She commissioned a single piece of bespoke clothing, not a designer gown, but a perfectly tailored suit from a small London tailor, constructed to fit her stronger, leaner physique precisely. It was undeniably expensive, but worth every penny, not because of the label, but because of how she felt when she wore it. Powerful, competent, and authentically herself. Grace was evolving into someone new, or perhaps, more accurately, she was finally becoming who she had always been beneath the layers of performance. She dated occasionally, but nothing serious, nothing that demanded a level of vulnerability she wasn't yet ready to offer. She had learned that her inherent worth wasn't contingent on being partnered, that she could be whole and complete while single. She cultivated genuine friendships with people who valued her mind and her company, not her utility or her connections. Dr. Okonkwo evolved from being simply her therapist. They met for coffee as equals, engaging in lively discussions about literature, politics, and the unique challenges faced by ambitious women navigating spaces designed primarily for men. Grace was happy, genuinely, unexpectedly happy, and she was also ready. The invitation arrived in April 2025, forwarded through old Vienna channels she had assumed were permanently closed. The annual philanthropic gala at the Vienna State Opera House, benefiting refugee assistance programs across Central Europe. It was the event of the season, the same gala Grace had once meticulously organized, the social pinnacle of Vienna's calendar. And this year it carried a particular significance. Thomas Delacroix and Clarissa Beaumont would be officially announcing their engagement, making it public after months of private celebration. The invitation was addressed to Grace Morrow, partner, Volov and Morrow Capital. Someone in Vienna's charitable circles had clearly taken notice of her remarkable rise. Someone had decided that she was, once again, worth inviting, now that she was successful on her own terms. Grace stared at the invitation for a long time. She could simply ignore it. She could continue building her fulfilling life in London, never looking back, never engaging with the people who had discarded her so readily. That would undoubtedly be the healthy choice, likely the choice Dr. Okonkwo would gently recommend. But Grace discovered something profound about herself in that moment. She wasn't finished with Vienna. Not quite yet. Not because she harbored any lingering feelings for Thomas. God, no. The mere thought of reconciliation was laughable, absurd. She had absolutely no desire to return to that life, to that diminished version of herself. But she needed them to see her, to witness what they had dismissed, what they had underestimated, what they had thought they had broken. She needed to walk back into Vienna as someone they couldn't ignore, couldn't diminish, couldn't relegate to the status of a cautionary tale. She wanted to reclaim her throne, not as Mrs. Delacroix, but as Grace Morrow. "I'm going to Vienna," Grace announced to Dr. Okonkwo during their next session. "For closure?" Dr. Okonkwo inquired cautiously. Grace offered a smile, sharp, feral, entirely new. "For triumph." She had 4 months to prepare. She did so with military precision. She hired a stylist, not simply to dress her, but to curate a single, unforgettable look for a single evening, something that would leave an indelible impression. Together, they conceived an ensemble that was both sophisticated and modern, expensive without being ostentatious, powerful without appearing to be trying too hard. She worked with a speaking coach, refining her presence, her voice, her ability to command a room. Not because she lacked confidence, she possessed it in abundance now, but because she wanted to be devastatingly effective. She arranged for a feature article in The Economist about emerging markets and the success of her fund, strategically timed for publication the week before the gala. She orchestrated carefully planned press coverage and strategic visibility. She was going to walk back into Vienna not as a ghost, not as a victim, but as an undeniable force. And she was going to savor every single second of it. The Vienna State Opera House stood illuminated against the crisp November night, its neo-Renaissance facade glowing with a golden light that rendered the building almost transcendent. Black cars and sleek limousines lined the street, depositing elegantly dressed attendees who ascended the grand staircase with practiced grace. Inside, the annual philanthropic gala was already in full swing. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across the grand reception hall, where Vienna's elite mingled with calculated casualness. Old aristocratic families whose fortunes predated nations mingled with new technology wealth desperately seeking social legitimacy. Diplomats and financiers and cultural figures whose fame was their own kind of currency. And there, at the very center of it all, stood Clarissa Beaumont. She looked exactly as she was supposed to. Expensive, polished, the kind of beautiful that required professional maintenance. Her dress was exquisite, handmade lace over silk, meticulously cut to accentuate her figure, accessorized with diamonds that captured the light with every subtle movement. Thomas had spared no expense on the ring that glittered on her left hand, a stone so large it bordered on vulgarity. Clarissa was holding court, surrounded by admirers and sycophants, accepting congratulations on her engagement with a practiced modesty that fooled absolutely no one. She had won, and everyone present knew it. She had taken Thomas Dell'Acqua from his accomplished wife and would soon formalize her position as the second Mrs. Dell'Acqua. "You look radiant," someone told her. "The ring is stunning," cooed another. "Thomas is so lucky," a third added. Though the underlying subtext was perfectly clear, Thomas had traded up. Thomas himself stood nearby, accepting handshakes and backslaps, playing the role of the satisfied man with the comfort of someone who had never seriously questioned his own worth. He looked older, subtle lines etched around his eyes, the beginning of jowls despite his undoubtedly expensive grooming regimen. Success and self-satisfaction had rendered him soft. "Congratulations," said one of his law partners, raising a champagne flute, though we all knew it was only a matter of time. "Some things are worth waiting for," Thomas replied, pulling Clarissa close with proprietary affection. The evening proceeded exactly as planned. Speeches about charitable impact, carefully orchestrated appeals for donations, performances by musicians from the Vienna Philharmonic. It was the kind of event that Vienna executed better than anywhere else in the world. Tradition and culture weaponized into social currency. Clarissa was in heaven. This was her night, her triumph, the official christening of her elevated status. Then, the orchestra paused between pieces, and the grand doors swung open. The room didn't fall silent. That only happens in movies. But conversation faltered. Attention shifted. Heads turned with that instinctive, gravitational pull towards something extraordinary entering orbit. Grace Morrow walked into the Vienna State Opera House. She walked alone. No date, no entourage, requiring neither. Her ensemble was perfection. A custom-tailored jumpsuit that moved like liquid, structured and sophisticated, paired with understated jewelry and simple heels. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek style that showcased the elegant lines of her face, now sharper, more defined than it had been 2 years prior. But it wasn't the clothing that captivated people's attention. It was her presence. Grace had transformed into something Vienna's elite rarely encountered. A woman who was entirely, unapologetically self-possessed. She didn't scan the room nervously or seek out friendly faces for reassurance. She simply existed in the space with complete confidence, as if the opera house had been built around her rather than the other way around. She looked magnificent. More importantly, she looked free. Margot Schneider reached her first, embracing Grace with genuine delight. "You came? I wasn't sure you would." "I wouldn't miss it," Grace replied, her voice warm and steady. Others approached, some out of genuine curiosity, others out of genuine pleasure at seeing her return. Grace greeted them all with perfect composure, answering questions about her life in London, the success of her fund, and the recent Economist profile with the casual humility of someone who had nothing left to prove. "Grace Morrow," someone murmured appreciatively. "I read about your fund. Impressive returns." "You look incredible," another added. "London clearly agrees with you." Across the room, Thomas had frozen, his champagne glass suspended halfway to his lips. Beside him, Clarissa's expression morphed from that of a confident queen to something far less composed. "Is that?" Clarissa began. "Grace," Thomas finished, his voice hollow. They watched as Grace moved through the crowd with effortless grace, accepting greetings, engaging in brief conversations, never lingering too long with any single person. She was working the room as she used to, but differently, not performing, not networking for advantage, simply being herself. And she was captivating. "Why is she here?" Clarissa hissed, suddenly acutely aware that people were looking at Grace instead of at her ring, her dress, her moment of triumph. "She was invited," Thomas said numbly. "She's a donor. The fund probably contributed significantly. You said she was ruined. You said she'd fallen apart. That's what I heard. That's what everyone said." But the woman across the room bore absolutely no resemblance to the broken, humiliated wife who had fled Vienna. This woman looked like she had been forged in fire and emerged as something harder, brighter, unbreakable. The gala coordinator approached Grace with obvious deference. "Ms. Morrow, we're so grateful for Volov and Morrow Capital's generous contribution to tonight's cause. Would you be willing to say a few words later in the evening, just briefly, about supporting refugee assistance programs?" "Of course," Grace agreed easily. Clarissa gripped Thomas's arm. "You need to do something." "Do what exactly?" "I don't know. Talk to her. Remind her that this is our night." But Thomas remained rooted to the spot. He couldn't move because looking at Grace now, really looking at her, he was experiencing the deeply uncomfortable realization that he might have made a catastrophic mistake. The woman he had dismissed as too ambitious, too cold, too focused on her work had transformed into someone extraordinary. Someone who had built something real and impressive entirely on her own terms. Someone who now looked at him with complete indifference. It was that indifference that unsettled him the most. Not anger, not hurt, not lingering pain, nothing. As if he were simply background noise in her story rather than a central character. When dinner was served, Grace was seated at one of the most prominent tables, not with old Vienna social connections, but with representatives from major humanitarian organizations, diplomats, and serious philanthropists. She engaged in substantive conversations about refugee policy, economic development, and sustainable aid programs. Not the performative charity discussions Thomas remembered from their marriage, but a genuine engagement with complex issues. She was brilliant. Everyone at her table thought so, leaning in to catch her words, laughing at her observations, treating her as someone whose opinion genuinely mattered. At their table, Clarissa picked at her food and watched Grace with increasing agitation. The evening that was supposed to celebrate Clarissa's victory had been hijacked by the woman she had replaced. And worse, far worse, Clarissa was discovering that in any direct comparison, she came up short. Clarissa was beautiful, yes, but decorative. Grace was substantive. Clarissa had won Thomas. Grace had won herself. The speeches began. Organizational leaders thanking donors, sharing impact statistics, telling moving stories about families helped by the programs the gala supported. Then Grace was introduced to say a few words. She walked to the small stage with easy confidence, standing at the microphone without notes, completely comfortable addressing a room of hundreds. "Thank you for having me tonight," Grace began, her voice clear and strong. "Many of you knew me in a different context years ago. Some of you were kind when my life fell apart." She paused, acknowledging Margot and a few others with a small nod. "Some of you weren't. That's fine. I learned important things from both experiences." The room was absolutely silent now, everyone transfixed. "I learned that an identity built on someone else's foundation will always be inherently unstable. That external validation is a drug that ultimately leaves you emptier than before. That the only security worth having is the kind you build yourself from your own competence, your own values, your own work." Grace's gaze swept across the audience, not seeking out anyone specific, not performing, simply speaking her truth. The programs we're supporting tonight help people rebuild from devastation, refugees who have lost everything. Homes, countries, the lives they knew. They arrive in new places with nothing but themselves and somehow find the courage to start over. That takes extraordinary strength. She smiled slightly. I'm not comparing my divorce to war or genocide, but I do understand something about rebuilding, about starting over with nothing familiar to hold on to, about discovering that you're stronger than you knew. Thomas's face had gone ashen. Clarissa looked as if she wanted to disappear. So, I'm grateful to support these programs, Grace continued, because I know what it means to be broken and to rebuild. And I know that sometimes the person who emerges from that rebuilding is better than who existed before, truer, less afraid, more herself. She paused, and in that moment, her eyes finally found Thomas across the room. Not with anger or triumph, but with simple recognition, as if seeing someone she used to know a long time ago. Thank you for your generous contributions tonight, Grace concluded. And for those of you rebuilding your own lives in whatever way, keep going. You're stronger than you know. The applause was thunderous, genuine, the kind of response that can't be manufactured. Grace stepped down from the stage and was immediately surrounded by people wanting to speak with her, to shake her hand, to tell her how moving her words had been. She was gracious with all of them, present and authentic in each interaction. Thomas stood frozen at his table, watching his ex-wife command the room's attention and admiration with effortless authenticity. Everything he had told himself about their divorce, that she had been too cold, too ambitious, too difficult, was revealing itself as a series of lies he had constructed to justify his own betrayal. Grace hadn't been the problem. He had been intimidated by her intelligence, threatened by her competence, uncomfortable with a wife who matched him rather than simply serving him. So, he had sought out someone less challenging, someone who flattered his ego rather than expanding his thinking. And now, watching Clarissa sulk beside him while Grace lit up the room with genuine substance, Thomas finally understood what he had thrown away. But it was far too late. The rest of the evening unfolded with Grace as the undeniable center of gravity. People sought her out, wanted to be seen talking to her, asked about her fund and her work with genuine interest. Magazine photographers requested shots, which she permitted with casual grace. Clarissa's moment had been completely eclipsed. The engagement announcement, planned for later in the evening, happened quietly, almost as an afterthought. A few people offered congratulations, but the energy had shifted. The room's attention was elsewhere, focused on the woman who had risen from the ashes and returned as fire itself. As the evening wound down, Grace prepared to leave. She had said what she had come to say, done what she had come to do. There was nothing left in Vienna that she needed. She was collecting her coat when Thomas appeared beside her, slightly drunk, definitely desperate. Grace. His voice cracked on her name. She turned, one eyebrow raised in polite inquiry, as if he were a stranger needing directions. Can we talk? Thomas asked. Privately. We're talking now, Grace replied coolly. I mean, really talk or about? He gestured helplessly. Everything. There's nothing to discuss, Thomas. Our divorce was finalized years ago. I made a mistake. The words tumbled out, urgent and pathetic. I see that now. God, Grace, you're extraordinary. I was a fool to let you go. Grace studied him with the clinical detachment one might apply to an interesting specimen under glass. You didn't let me go. You traded me in for a younger model who told you what you wanted to hear. That was your choice, and you got exactly what you wanted. Clarissa isn't. She's not like you. She's exactly what you deserve, Grace finished gently. I hope you'll be very happy together. She meant it, not sarcastically, genuinely, because Thomas's happiness or misery no longer had any impact on her life whatsoever. I still love you, Thomas said desperately. No, you don't. You love the idea of what I've become, because it's finally more appealing than what I was when you had me. But I was always this person, Thomas. You were just too mediocre to recognize it. They weren't cruel, not in the way you might expect. They were simply brutally honest, delivered without a hint of malice, without even a flicker of anger, devoid of any emotional inflection whatsoever. That was what devastated him most, that utter absence of feeling. Goodbye, Thomas, Grace said as she shrugged on her coat. Have a good life. She walked out of the Vienna State Opera House and disappeared into the biting November night, leaving Thomas standing alone in the rapidly emptying hall, tears welling in his eyes and the crushing weight of his own foolishness bearing down on him. Outside, Grace took a deep breath of Vienna's air. A familiar, crisp scent, but it no longer felt like home. She had closed a chapter, not through some grand gesture of reconciliation or a bitter act of revenge, but through the quiet, powerful act of being so completely herself that the past simply lost its hold. She felt lighter, freer, utterly complete. Vienna had been her city once, but she had undeniably outgrown it. Tomorrow she would return to London, to her real life, to the future she was meticulously building, one deliberate choice at a time. Tonight she had reclaimed her story, and that, she realized, was more than enough. The flight from Vienna to London was a mere 2 hours. Grace spent those hours gazing out the window at the clouds, now illuminated by the soft glow of moonlight, quietly processing what she felt, or perhaps more accurately, what she didn't feel. She had expected triumph to taste sweeter, had almost certainly imagined that walking back into Vienna a success would deliver some kind of monumental emotional catharsis. But standing in that grand opera house, seeing Thomas's devastated face, watching Clarissa's carefully constructed facade crumble before her eyes, none of it had felt remotely like victory. It had felt like closure, plain and simple. And there was, she realized, a significant difference between the two. Victory, at its core, required an opponent. It demanded that you measure yourself against what you had ultimately defeated. But Grace had stopped defining herself in opposition to Thomas and Clarissa ages ago. Their downfall wasn't her success, not even close. Their misery certainly wasn't her happiness. She had simply, irrevocably moved on. And that, she realized as the plane began its descent over the sprawling, shimmering lights of London, was the real, unadulterated liberation. The apartment in Notting Hill welcomed her like a long-lost friend, warm, familiar, and entirely, undeniably hers. Grace kicked off her heels, hung up her coat, and made a cup of tea in the small kitchen that always smelled reassuringly like home. Her phone had been buzzing incessantly throughout the flight. There were messages from people who had attended the gala, forwarded photos pulled from social media, and news that the story of her dramatic return was already ricocheting through Vienna's intricate social networks. Grace glanced through them briefly, then consciously set the phone aside. Other people's narratives about her life, their interpretations and opinions no longer mattered. Let them tell whatever stories they wanted. She was done caring. She knew the fundamental truth, that she had rebuilt herself not for revenge, not to prove anything to anyone else, but because she steadfastly refused to be broken by circumstances she hadn't chosen, by a fate that had been thrust upon her. She thought about Thomas's desperate confession, "I still love you," and felt only a dull ache of pity. He had, she realized, fundamentally mistaken ownership for love, had confused the act of possessing her with actually valuing her as a human being. He loved the trophy she'd become in his mind, not the actual person she was, flaws and all. Clarissa could have him. They genuinely deserved each other. Two people seemingly more concerned with appearances than substance, with social status than authenticity, with the hollow victory of winning than actually being worthy of what they'd won. The next morning, Grace woke early and went for a run through Holland Park. The November air was frigid and sharp, burning her lungs in a way that felt strangely cleansing. She pushed her body hard, relishing the strength she'd painstakingly built, the physicality she'd reclaimed as her own. When she returned to the apartment, a message from Dr. Okonkwo was waiting for her. Asterisk saw the photos. "Call me when you're ready to process." They met for coffee that afternoon at their usual spot in Bloomsbury, a quiet, unassuming cafe that served excellent espresso and knew how to mind its own business. "So," Dr. Okonkwo said, studying Grace's face intently, "how do you feel?" Grace considered the question seriously, turning it over in her mind like a precious stone. "Lighter," she said finally. "Like I've put down something heavy I didn't realize I was still carrying. Closure, definitely. But it's more than that, too. Completion, maybe? I went back to Vienna thinking I needed to show them what I'd become. But standing there, I realized they already didn't matter. I'd moved on before I even got on the plane. Dr. Okonkwo smiled, a warm, genuine expression. That's significant growth, Grace. It doesn't feel like growth, Grace admitted. Feels like quiet, like the constant noise in my head has finally stopped. That's what healing sounds like, Dr. Okonkwo said gently. Not always dramatic, just peaceful. They talked for another hour. Not about Thomas or Clarissa or the gala, but about Grace's life moving forward. The fund was growing beyond even her most optimistic projections. Mikhail was talking seriously about expansion, possibly opening offices in Warsaw and Bucharest. Grace would need to hire to build a real team to scale from being a solo consultant to an actual leader. It was exciting, undeniably challenging, the kind of work that demanded everything she had to give. Are you happy? Dr. Okonkwo asked as they were leaving, that perceptive gaze fixed on her once again. Grace thought about it, about her apartment that felt like a true sanctuary, about work that engaged her mind completely, about weekends spent hiking in the Cotswolds or visiting museums or reading novels she actually wanted to read rather than books that simply seemed sophisticated and impressive. About the absence of performance, the freedom from needing to be anything other than herself. Yes, she said, surprised by how simply, undeniably true it was. Yes, I'm happy. The weeks following the gala brought unexpected, but welcome, developments. The piece in The Economist had generated significant interest from investors and entrepreneurs all across Europe. Grace's calendar quickly filled with meetings, pitch presentations, due diligence discussions. Volov and Maro Capital was rapidly becoming a major player in the Eastern European tech investment scene. Grace was meticulously careful about which opportunities they chose to pursue. She had learned hard lessons about building on solid foundations rather than simply chasing impressive facades. Every investment went through a rigorous, often painstaking analysis. Every partnership was carefully vetted for authentic alignment of values rather than mere strategic advantage. She was building something that would last because it was being built right. Mikhail flew to London in December to discuss the increasingly ambitious expansion plans. They met at Grace's office, a clean, modern space in Shoreditch that felt appropriately ambitious without being ostentatious or trying too hard. We're getting acquisition interest, Mikhail said, sliding a stack of papers across the conference table. Major American firms want to buy us out. The numbers are significant, Grace said, reviewing the offers. They were, indeed, exceptionally significant, enough money to retire comfortably, to never work another day in her life if she so chose. What do you want to do? Mikhail asked, his expression unreadable. Grace set down the papers, her decision already made. I want to build, not cash out. Build something real. We're just getting started, Mikhail. There's so much untapped potential in these markets that Western capital still doesn't fully understand. We could be the bridge. We could do something truly important. Mikhail grinned, a wide, genuine smile that reached his eyes. This is exactly why we're partners, Grace. Same answer I would give. They declined the acquisition offers and instead secured additional funding for expansion, opening their Warsaw office in January of 2026. Grace spent more time traveling, not running from anything now, but actively building towards something meaningful. She met with entrepreneurs in Krakow and Sofia, toured tech incubators in Tallinn and Vilnius, and gave keynote speeches at investment conferences across Europe. She was steadily becoming known not as simply Thomas Diokwa's ex-wife, but as Grace Morrow, investor, entrepreneur, someone worth listening to in her own right. The transformation felt complete, not because external circumstances had dramatically changed, but because her internal landscape had fundamentally shifted. She no longer measured herself against other people's arbitrary standards. She no longer craved validation from the very spaces that had once rejected her. She had finally become the unquestioned authority in her own life. In February, Grace received an unexpected email from Clarissa. The subject line was simply, "I'm sorry." Grace almost deleted it unread, dismissing it as an attempt to re-engage. But then curiosity, a persistent and often unreliable force, won out. Grace, the email began, **I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to read this. but I felt like I needed to write it. You were right about everything. Thomas isn't who I thought he was. The life I thought I wanted, it's hollow, exhausting. I spend all my time maintaining an image, performing for people who don't actually care about me, playing a role that feels less real every day. I watch videos of you speaking at conferences. You look so confident, so clear about who you are. I envy that more than you know. I destroyed your marriage because I was shallow and selfish and thought social status mattered more than substance. I was wrong, Grace. So incredibly wrong. I'm sorry. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know that you were the winner in every way that actually matters. Grace read the email twice, carefully considering each word. She felt no smug satisfaction from it, no real sense of vindication, just a distant, almost detached sadness for a woman who had chased a hollow prize and was only now, belatedly, realizing its fundamental emptiness. She didn't respond. There was quite simply nothing left to say. Clarissa's journey was her own now, and Grace had absolutely no role to play in it. She deleted the email and consciously moved on. Spring came to London, transforming the city's parks into vibrant explosions of daffodils and delicate cherry blossoms. Grace turned 35 in April, celebrating with a small, intimate dinner at her apartment. Margot flew in from Vienna, eager to celebrate. Dr. Okonkwo brought a carefully selected bottle of wine. Mikhail told increasingly absurd stories about early investments that had somehow succeeded despite being objectively terrible ideas. It was a genuinely good evening. Simple, authentic, surrounded by people who knew her and genuinely liked her not for what she could provide them, but for who she actually was, deep down. You seem different, Margot observed quietly as they cleaned up after dinner. A perceptive observation as always. More settled, somehow. I think I finally figured out who I'm supposed to be, Grace replied with a thoughtful smile. And who's that? Margot asked, her eyebrows raised in playful curiosity. Exactly who I am, Grace said simply. It sounded almost trite, but it was, in fact, profoundly true. Grace had stopped trying so desperately to be impressive and had simply become extraordinarily competent. She had stopped performing success for an audience and had started actually succeeding, in a real and tangible way. She had stopped actively seeking love and had started, finally, truly loving herself. The exquisite irony was that once she stopped needing external validation, it came anyway. Not from everyone, of course. She would likely never win over Vienna's old guard, would almost certainly never be invited back into certain rarefied social circles, but it came from the people who genuinely mattered, who were capable of recognizing authentic substance when they saw it. Grace was offered positions on various boards. She declined most of them, accepting only those that were genuinely aligned with her core values. Organizations working on economic development, refugee assistance, and women's entrepreneurship. She also started mentoring young women entering the often daunting world of finance, particularly those from non-traditional backgrounds. She vividly remembered what it had felt like to be the girl from Marseilles trying to navigate Vienna's elite circles, never quite sure if she truly belonged. She wanted to make it a little easier for others who found themselves in similar situations. She dated occasionally, a few dinners with interesting men, one brief relationship with a Dutch architect that ended amicably when they both realized they ultimately wanted different things out of life. Grace wasn't desperate for partnership anymore. If it happened organically, wonderful. If not, she was perfectly complete on her own. That, she realized, was the real and lasting freedom. Knowing, deep down, that she didn't need anyone else to validate her existence. In June, Grace received a coveted invitation to speak at a major economics conference in Geneva. The primary topic was emerging markets and alternative investment strategies, precisely her area of expertise. She accepted without hesitation. Geneva in the summer was undeniably beautiful. Lake Leman sparkling under the clear alpine sky, the city itself elegant and understated in that particular, inherently Swiss way. The conference was being held at a luxurious hotel on the lakefront, attended by hundreds of prominent investors, economists, and financial leaders from all across Europe. Grace's keynote address was scheduled for the second day. She spent the evening before quietly reviewing her presentation, though she barely needed the notes anymore. She knew the material inside and out, had lived it, had proved it with tangible results. The next morning, she dressed carefully in her custom-made suit, the one that always made her feel invincible, and walked to the conference hall with a quiet, steady confidence. The room was packed, standing room only. Grace immediately recognized faces in the audience. Investors she'd worked with, competitors she respected, and journalists from major financial publications. And then, in the back row, partially hidden in shadow, she saw Thomas. Grace saw him the instant she stepped onto the stage. Their eyes met for a brief, fleeting second. Then she deliberately looked away, her expression utterly unchanged. His presence meant absolutely nothing. He was simply another person in the audience, no more or less significant than anyone else. She began her presentation. For 45 minutes, Grace expertly walked the audience through her well-researched thesis on Eastern European tech investment, explaining why Western investors consistently undervalued these often overlooked markets, what specific cultural and economic factors they were missing, and how strategic positioning could, in fact, generate extraordinary returns. She supported every claim with solid data and compelling evidence. She anticipated potential counterarguments and deftly addressed them preemptively. She used carefully chosen case studies from her own portfolio, showing specific examples of how her unique approach had consistently succeeded where conventional wisdom said it would inevitably fail. It was a masterclass not just in innovative investment strategy, but in expertise delivered with unwavering confidence and crystal-clear clarity. The applause at the end was enthusiastic and sustained. The Q&A session ran long because people kept eagerly raising their hands, wanting to engage with her insightful ideas, challenge her underlying assumptions, and learn from her extensive experience. Grace handled every question with poise and intelligence, never once becoming defensive, always substantive. When the session finally ended, she was immediately surrounded by people wanting to exchange business cards, schedule follow-up conversations, and pitch their own companies for potential investment. Grace was gracious with all of them, fully present and utterly professional. Thomas didn't approach her. He simply watched from the back of the room as person after person sought Grace's attention, eager to glean from her expertise and secure a sliver of her valuable time. He watched her laugh at someone's joke, nod thoughtfully at another's insightful question, and hand out her business card to a third. He watched the woman he had once so carelessly discarded command respect and genuine admiration through sheer competence and undeniable skill, realized fully, perhaps for the first time, exactly what he had thrown away, and then he left quietly, almost unnoticed, before Grace could even acknowledge his presence again. Not that she would have, of course. She was far too engaged with her actual life to even notice the lingering ghosts from her distant past. That evening, Grace walked along the shores of Lake Geneva as the sun set, painting the towering Alps in breathtaking shades of amber and rose. She thought about the long and arduous journey from that terrible Thursday afternoon in Vienna to this very moment, from utter devastation to painstaking rebuilding to what could, without exaggeration, be called triumph. But triumph wasn't quite the right word. Liberation felt closer to the truth. She had liberated herself from the suffocating need to be anyone's wife, anyone's accessory, anyone's pet project. She had liberated herself from the insidious grip of shame and humiliation and the paralyzing fear of other people's judgment. She had liberated herself from measuring her inherent worth by external metrics and had finally found lasting value in her own undeniable competence, her unwavering integrity, and her own capacity for joy. This was freedom, she realized. Not the dramatic, cinematic version where the heroine decimates her enemies and triumphantly stands on their ashes, but the quiet, profound freedom of simply being herself, authentically and without apology or the need for performance. Grace pulled out her phone and took a photo of the stunning sunset, not for social media or external validation, but simply for herself, to quietly remember this moment. Then she walked back to her hotel, ordered room service, and worked diligently on due diligence for a promising Estonian startup until she finally fell asleep with her laptop still open. The next morning, she flew back to London and back to her real life, the life she had painstakingly built from absolutely nothing, the life that was entirely, authentically, and powerfully hers. Grace Morrow's story didn't end with a perfectly tied bow. Life rarely does. She continued to build her fund, making smart investments, and steadily growing her influence in the complex world of European finance. She had both successes and failures, good days and difficult ones, moments of perfect clarity and periods of unsettling doubt. But she had something far more valuable than a fairy tale ending. She had herself, whole, complete, and unapologetically uncompromising. She had learned the hardest and most important lesson of all, that you simply cannot build a lasting life on someone else's shaky foundation. That external validation is ultimately just a flimsy house of cards. That the only security worth truly having is the kind you painstakingly build from your own competence, your own unwavering values, and your own dedicated work. She had learned that being left behind doesn't automatically mean you're worthless. Sometimes, it simply means you're too valuable for people who can only appreciate surface-level shine. She had learned that revenge is empty, but living well, authentically, and intentionally is profoundly substantial. And most importantly, she had learned that you don't actually need anyone's permission to rebuild yourself. Not society's, not your ex-partner's, not even your own past selves. You just need to wholeheartedly decide you're worth the considerable effort and then relentlessly do the work. So, in the end, this story isn't just about Grace Morrow. It's about every woman who has ever been discarded, underestimated, told she wasn't enough, or was somehow too much. Every woman who has looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself because she'd spent so long performing for other people's expectations. Every woman who thought she was irrevocably broken and discovered she was actually just beginning a new, more authentic chapter. You are not your relationship status. You are not your past mistakes. You are not what someone else decided you were when they couldn't see your true value. You are what you build from here, brick by painstaking brick. And if you're currently in the middle of your own challenging rebuilding process, if you're huddled in that dark hotel room, or walking alone by the river, or cleaning someone else's house and crying in the service elevator, please know this, deep in your heart. You are stronger than you realize. You contain multitudes of potential you haven't even discovered yet. And the person you're actively becoming might just be the truest, best version of yourself you've ever been. Grace didn't win by somehow getting Thomas back. She won by realizing, deep down, that she didn't even want him. She won by becoming someone who simply couldn't be diminished by other people's failures to truly see her clearly. She won by building a life so rich and full and authentically hers that the past finally lost its insidious power to wound. That's the victory that's available to all of us, if we're brave enough to reach for it. Not the dramatic, Instagram-worthy version, but the quiet, profound freedom of simply being yourself without apology or the need for performance. Of knowing your inherent worth not because someone else finally validated it, but because you built something real and lasting with your own two hands. Of walking confidently into rooms not to prove anything to anyone, but because you genuinely belong there. That's the throne worth reclaiming, in the end. Not the one someone else sits on, but the one that resides deep within yourself. So here's to Grace Morrow. Here's to every woman who bravely rebuilds her own life. And here's to liberation, in all its quiet and profound forms.